And last week, we came quite close to losing British imperialism entirely. And so the idea that American imperialism, British imperialism, know what they're doing and going about some preordained plan to restructure, reorganize the world, I think is tosh. They're all over the place. That's what's illustrated by what's happened in Iraq. That's what's illustrated what's happening in Ukraine. And that's what's illustrated by the Scottish referendum. Although they won, they only just won. Given the fact that all the political parties and the economic forces in society suddenly were mobilised to come out with this grand scare story. Scotland's going to collapse, there'll be economic catastrophe and blood on the streets. And nothing can function, no pound note, nothing can function without Britain. To get 45% was quite an achievement. I thought they might do it, but you know, obviously there are a lot of Tories in Scotland, with a small Conservative, who basically came out the woodwork to defend the status quo. And they ran a massive campaign. Did anybody see that speech by Gordon Brown the day before the vote?
I just heard it.
Gordon Brown said, it was quite amusing, I was listening to it, I turned it on and I listened to it, and he says, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs.
He said that?
Karl Marx, that is what Britain stands for. That's what he said. In other words, the highest stage of communism, that's what Marx called the highest stage of communism, that is what Britain stands for. That's what he said.
Well, Marx
so
they
will stoop to any level at all to maintain their wealth, power and privilege. And as far as they were concerned, the loss of Scotland was the loss of that. And they're not wrong, because had Scotland voted for independence, British imperialism would have been reduced to a minute mouse on the world stage. That's the fact of the matter. And that's what they were so scared of.
Why, Scotland's only a few million people.
Yes, but no one would have taken any notice of Britain around the world had Scotland broken away. Who are you to tell us, they would say. You know. And so that's why the British were so scared, not because of anything about the economic problems. Economically might have been beneficial, you don't know. We don't know what would have happened economically. Many countries have done quite well out of separation.
The problem was, though, Heiko, that nor did Alex Salmond know economically what was going to happen, and he couldn't answer a very simple question.
That's perfectly true.
Really let people down.
That's perfectly true.
It's his fault in the end.
But
because he could have said, he could have come out with some very astute arguments. He could have actually asked them to explain quantitative easing to the British public, and then say, you answer that, then I'll answer your question.
The fact of the matter is, Alex Salmond represents, or tries to represent, the Scottish capitalist class, which is a relatively small proportion of Scotland's population. They have a high ownership of the territory, but of course the territory, a lot of it is just forests and farmland, and therefore the fact of the matter is, the Scottish bourgeoisie were arguing for their own nation state. That's true. But the sentiment behind it, of course, was something different. Because Scotland had, or has, a slightly better welfare state than England, and they haven't suffered as much as England and Wales and Northern Ireland have, as a consequence of having policies like tuition fees not being paid and free health, free medicine, then the population felt that this was the old-style welfare consensus that exists in Scotland and doesn't exist in the rest of Britain. And of course, the British politicians, once they realised they were in danger of losing, they pulled out all the stops, and every single lie in the book they came out with. Every single lie you could imagine. We're all together. In fact, David Cameron even made it, he said, the next government will be Labour anyway, so there's nothing to worry about. David Cameron told them to say that. Told the representatives of Number 10 to go around spreading this rumour. And then they dragged out Gordon Brown. The reason I watched that video of Gordon Brown's speech was because someone posted a thing on my Facebook and they said to me, Gordon Brown has taken Viagra. And then you watched him speak, and he was speaking from the heart. The first time Mr. Wooden and Mr. Grey speaks from the heart. Because his position and his authority is based upon the Scottish Presbyterian, square-faced political class that had a big influence inside British politics. Sorry?
Shouldn't he have been speaking from the genitals if he had taken
I think he was. I think he was. If you listen to his speech, a number of times he completely faffs up, but because of the energy he's putting into it, then it works. It works. And certainly this idea of quoting Karl Marx as a British value and the most fundamental British value seems a little bit odd. And then he was making out that Britain is the great uniter of countries. Not only did Britain unite, he said, but they united the whole world in some sort of wonderful, peaceful harmony. He forgot about all the murders they carried out in Kenya, Malaya, India. He forgot about the bombing of China, the bombing of Iraq, the bombing of Afghanistan, the conquest of Africa, the plundering even of America. They forget about all of these things because Britain is the unifying nation. And because, of course, a significant layer of the British population are so ignorant about history, they think that this is true. Britain is somehow a united entity, come about by the will of the people. The union of Britain and Scotland was not a voluntary union of the peoples, it was a union of the elite who rule over the people without any right to vote, any right to speak, any right to demonstrate. If you spoke out at the time of the Scottish Union, they used to hang people by the neck in Hyde Park for speaking out against the government. And if you didn't like what they did, even in the 1840s, if you disagreed with the government and acted on it in the 1840s, they would imprison you, put you on a boat and transport you to Australia, right? So don't tell us this was a union of the people. It's complete and absolute bullshit. Bullshit. Just the same as the argument that Britain is better united because that's the people of Britain decided. It's not the people of Britain that decided. The vote on Sunday was not decided by the people of Scotland or by the people of Britain. It was decided by big business, taking a stance to say that the economy will collapse if the Scottish people vote against. In other words, extra parliamentary and extra electoral forces were brought to bear on a massive scale to prevent Britain from falling apart. That's what it was about. And when they say Britain, what do we mean by Britain? Britain is a country not run by the people, for the people. Britain is a country owned by a few people, controlled by a few people, manipulated by a few people. They control 70% of the stock market valuation of this country is controlled by 150 companies. 150 companies. 47% of Britain is owned by 6,000 families. 6,000. Many of those families have owned this country since the Norman conquest. And so when they turn around and say, Britain is the people of Britain, it is absolute bullshit. It is Britain is the Britain of the elite, of a tiny minority. We stand on the land belongs to the Queen. Just across the road here belongs to Duke of Westminster. From there up until Marylebone belongs to the Portman family, Lord and Lady Portman's family. They are Britain. They own Britain. They represent Britain. And their politicians, who they train and educate to go to Oxford, until the 1960s they used to have 2 votes, one in Oxford, one at their home constituency. They changed that recently, but that was basically, that reflects their attitude. The people of Britain didn't have the right to vote until 1928. 1928. Yet the British Parliament, Westminster, the House of Commons, that existed since 1247. So in other words, for more than 800 years, for 800 years or 700 years, there was a parliament, but none of us had a say in what happened in that parliament. The only people who had a say were those who had property. And it is that property genesis of the system that ultimately is what they are defending. When they say, you must vote this way, that's what they're defending. Because the night after the election, you saw the type of forces at play. If they think they're going to lose the election, then they're prepared to mobilise the mass media, big business, all the political parties suddenly come together. The day before they're at each other's throats. Everyone's against each other. Then we're all together. Britons together, waving the flag. Waving the flag for what? So that we can drop bombs on Afghanistan? So we can drop bombs on Iraq? So we can conquer Africa? Plunder India? 3 million Indians were starved to death, 1943. Have they received compensation? Not a word of it. Not a word of it. The Mau Mau, sorry? Compensation what?
Well, you can't compensate someone who's stuffed it, can you?
Compensate their family, you can compensate their relatives, you can compensate their country, but instead of this they compensated nothing. What they did do in India was they orchestrated a campaign to divide India. So Pakistan and India separated from one another, and nearly 1 million people were killed in the bloodbath orchestrated by the British, by Lord Mountbatten and co. So the idea that they compensated the Indian people, I think it's a complete lie. The truth of the matter is, someone mentioned earlier on that Alex Salmond is responsible for the defeat. Well, that's true. I mean, I'm not Scottish. I've got no interest in Scottish independence whatsoever. None. But I watched the campaign, I observed what was going on, and I could see the ruling class mobilising everything they could to prevent the defeat of British imperialism. That's why Barack Obama jumped in as well. Barack Obama suddenly has got an opinion. I mean, it's not even like someone might have had some connection like Bill Clinton had a connection with Ireland. Yeah, Barack Obama, what connection? I think somewhere in the north of England, he's got some distant family or something like that. But he weighs in and he says, we can't have this. Sorry? Bloodlines, yeah. We can't have this. Why can't we have this? Because the interests of the elite around the world dictate that when America wants to bomb a country, ideally they've got the lapdog sticking their tongue up the backside of the American establishment and dropping bombs as well, and justifying it by their interconnections across the world, which they established during the period of imperialism and which they maintained after direct colonial occupation disappeared. And that's why in many countries around the world you have post-colonial governments whose entire political apparatus is a reflection or a repetition of the British political elite's apparatus. And many of them, their leadership of their countries, like Pakistan, like much of India, like many countries in Africa, many countries in Asia, the elite of those countries, they are trained at British institutions. Sandhurst for the army, Oxford for the barristers and the politicians, Cambridge for the barristers, politicians and officials. So thank you very much for letting me move back. If you want me to move on, I'll move. Sorry, what's that? Good. I will duly submit to this payment. So they maintain wealth and power by a relationship to a whole series of institutional forces which replicate the structure of British capitalism. And that is the reason they feared Scottish independence, because they feared that a breakaway inside Britain itself would lead people all around the world who had previously followed this institutional arrangement to question the way in which their institutions of power are organised. In some countries, they even have, they sit round. I've been in Pakistan, for example. In Pakistan, the ruling elite, they have tea with milk, scones in the afternoon, scrambled eggs in the morning, and they love drinking whiskey, even though they say it's illegal. Yeah, they love drinking the whiskey and the beer. They got beer and whiskey for Christians, but actually the main consumers are Muslims.
No. Don't forget
and
the
so
pies.
The idea that this is some sort of Muslim-run country is just nonsense. And then the army, the Pakistani army, many of them received their training in Sandhurst and at the elite schools, also in America, but at the elite schools in Sandhurst. So this is what the British ruling class were trying to maintain. It had nothing to do with the unity, with the people of Scotland, the will of the people of Scotland, us being together. That's all bullshit. Actually, if the truth be told, many of the most vicious layers within the British Army during the period of direct colonial occupation were Scottish agents. Many of them were also used in Ireland to repress the Irish people. So the breakdown of British imperialism would have represented a fundamental body blow to the system of capitalism in Britain, despite the fact that Alex Salmond supports capitalism and that the capitalism wasn't being brought into question.
sometimes symbols are important. And that symbol was a very important symbol for them to mobilise around and galvanise around. That is why they did. They pulled out all the stops to stop the election or stop the vote for an independent state. Now you can understand when you see that over an issue which ultimately looked like just a simple constitutional vote. Now you can understand how the ruling class will react. If Labour was ever to have a programme to defend the rights of the working class, to improve the welfare state, to change the living standards in favour of the poor and against the rich, now you see how they will respond. Every single business leader in the country will come out and say, this is impossible. It will create chaos. The people will be starving. There'll be riots on the streets. All the politicians will unite. This is impossible. Cannot be done. Will result in conflict, maybe even in war. That's the way they'll argue. And that is the reason why. When social change comes about, when the mass of people realise their condition and its historical origin, and when they seek to bring about fundamental change in wealth and power throughout the whole of Britain, that revolutionary change in consciousness will be met with the full force of the British state and will require a transformation of society that smashes those institutions of the British state that seek to maintain the wealth, power and authority of a tiny elite of several thousand people who actually own and control what they call Britain. When those helicopters fly above our heads and watch the demonstrations, when the police are mobilised and they swear their allegiance to the Crown, when the army drops bombs, they swear their allegiance to the Crown. That is what it's about. The Crown represents the elite, the idea that a tiny group of people should have the wealth, should have the power, and have that indefinitely. Once people's opinion changes and they realise that the so-called Great Recession is not a temporary phenomenon whereby one day house prices will rise again and we'll all be living in the wonderful land, or better said, when house prices will continue rising and we'll all be living in a land again like 2008 where people are living prosperously and living standards constantly improving. When people realise that's out the window, that actually the only means of achieving improvements is entering the road of struggle, then we will realise that the only way to change society is by organising and mobilising around a programme of fundamental social transformation in wealth and power. Public ownership of the banks, public ownership of the major industries, and democratic control of the resources of the country, of the means of producing wealth, of the banks, of the major industries, of the major companies on the stock market. Then we can plan what is done with our country rather than them telling us what must be done with their country, which they claim is our country. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
You are correct, brother.
See you later.